She slammed the pan so hard the fire cracked and the whole kitchen shook. 10 years. 10 years of silence, of invisible hands, of a name nobody learned. And tonight, Harold Vickers had done the one thing she swore she would never forgive. He had thrown her biscuits into the dirt, in front of everyone, and laughed. Mabel Hartwell stood in that kitchen alone, shaking not from fear. From the moment she finally realized she had been slowly disappearing one quiet day at a time. If this story speaks to your heart, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The pan hit the wall so hard, it left a black smear across the old wood, and Mabel Hartwell stood there in the middle of the kitchen with her chest heaving and her hands still shaking from the impact. She had not meant to throw it, or maybe she had. She wasn't sure anymore. The kitchen was empty now. The ranch hands had scattered after Harold Vickers' performance in the dining room, and the sound of boots scraping against the floorboards had faded out toward the bunkhouses and the yard. Nobody had come to check on her. Nobody ever did. That was simply the agreement the world had made with Mabel Hartwell. She would keep her place, keep her hands busy, and keep her mouth shut. And in return, the world would continue to pretend she existed just enough to be useful. She pressed both palms flat against the work table and stared down at the surface, at the flour still dusted across the grain of the wood, at the small bowl of sourdough starter she had covered with a cloth before dinner service, at the worn grooves. Her knuckles had carved into the edge of that table over the course of 1,000 mornings she would never get back. Her mother's starter. That was the one thing in this building that belonged to her. Just that one small thing. She could still hear Harold's voice in her head. That high, satisfied voice he used when he wanted the room to know he was in charge of something or someone. "You call these biscuits, my dog eats better than this, and he don't even have manners." He had picked up the basket, her biscuits, the ones she had been up since 4 in the morning to prepare, and he had walked to the front door of the station and thrown them into the yard, right into the dirt, right where the horses walked. And the men at the table had laughed. Not because it was funny. They laughed because Harold laughed first, and at Red Hollow Station you laughed when Harold Vickers laughed, or you made yourself invisible until the moment passed. Mabel had stood in the kitchen doorway with her apron twisted in both hands, and she had not said a word. Because she had learned slowly, painfully across years of silence, that words cost her more than she could afford to pay. Every time she had tried to explain herself, Harold used it against her. Every time she had quietly pushed back, he found 3 new ways to make the next week harder. So she had stood there. She had let the men laugh. She had gone back into the kitchen, closed the door behind her, and then she had picked up the cast-iron pan and thrown it against the wall. And even that small, private, trembling act of fury had to stay behind a closed door. She breathed slowly. In, out. The way her mother had taught her, standing in a different kitchen, in a different life. In a time when Mabel had believed the world was basically fair if you were basically good. She was 25 years old, and she already understood that was not true. She crossed the kitchen and bent to pick up the pan from the floor. It had left a dent just barely in the wooden base of the wall, and she pressed her thumb into the mark and thought for a moment that she could not remember the last time anyone at this station had asked her a single question that wasn't about food. Not one question about her life. Not one question about where she came from. Not one question about what she wanted. She had become so good at silence that she was afraid silence had become all she was. She set the pan back on the hook and smoothed her apron with both hands and told herself to get back to work. There were dishes to wash. There were breakfast preparations to begin. There was the starter to feed and the fire to tend, and the never-ending machinery of other people's comfort to maintain. She was halfway to the basin when she heard the door. Not the front door, the side door. The one that opened from the yard directly into the kitchen. Travelers sometimes used it by accident, thinking it was a supply entrance, and she usually had to send them around. She turned. The man standing in her kitchen doorway was not what she expected. He was tall. The kind of tall that required a slight duck to clear a doorframe, with trail dust still settled across the shoulders of a dark coat and a hat that had seen better decades. He wasn't young. There were lines in his face that came from years of sun and squinting at horizons, and his jaw was set with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been riding for a very long time and had not slept well at the end of it. Howe was looking around her kitchen with an expression she could not immediately read. Then he looked at her. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't waste itself on extra words. "Wrong door. I'll go around." "It's fine," Mabel said automatically. She said it the way she said most things, quickly, quietly, designed to cause as little disruption as possible. "Dining room's through there." He nodded, but he didn't move right away. Howe was looking at the work table, at the sourdough bowl, at the flour across the wood, and the organized rows of tins on the shelf above the fire. "You do all this yourself?" he asked. Mabel blinked. "I'm sorry." "The cooking." He gestured at the kitchen, a simple motion that somehow managed to acknowledge the entire room. "Just you?" "Yes," she said. Howe made a small sound, not quite a word, more like a thought that had decided not to become one, and then he tipped his hat slightly and went back through the side door, and Mabel heard his boots on the steps as he made his way around to the front. She stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought that was strange. Then she went back to her dishes and forgot about him entirely. Or tried to. The day had already given her enough to carry, and there was no room in her head for a stranger who had walked in the wrong door. He was just a traveler. Red Hollow saw dozens of them. They came, they ate, they complained, or they didn't, and they left. Not one of them had ever mattered more than the meal they required. She dried her hands and got back to work. The dining room at Red Hollow Station could seat 12 men uncomfortably and 8 men with some degree of peace, and on this particular evening it held 11, which meant uncomfortable. Wyatt Callahan took the only open seat at the far end of the table, set his hat on the hook behind him, and waited for whatever passed for dinner. He had been driving cattle for 6 weeks across country that made a man reconsider certain choices he had made in his life, and he was tired in the specific way that reached past his muscles and settled somewhere deeper. He was not in the mood for conversation. He was not in the mood for company. He wanted food and silence, and 8 hours of something resembling sleep. The food that arrived was, to use the most charitable possible word, fine. The stew was warm. It had protein in it. It would keep him alive until morning, which was the minimum requirement for a meal. He ate it without registering much about it, listening to the men around him argue about grazing rights with the particular loud confidence of people who had been indoors all day. Then the biscuits arrived. He almost didn't take one. He was nearly full, and his attention was already drifting toward the stairs and the bunk he'd been assigned, and the basket was passed down the table like an afterthought, like something the server had almost forgotten. But his hand moved on instinct, the way hands do when they've been hungry long enough, and he broke open the biscuit without looking at it. The first bite stopped him completely. It wasn't that it was good. Good was a word for things you noticed and appreciated and moved past. This was something else. This was the kind of thing that made a man pause mid-motion, with his arm still raised and his jaw working slowly, as if his body needed to verify that what it was experiencing was real. The biscuit was warm in the center, the way things are only warm when they've just come from somewhere that understood heat, not just applied it, but understood it. There was a depth to the flavor that Wyatt, who was not a man who spent much time thinking about food, did not have the vocabulary to describe accurately. It was the flavor of something that had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had somehow decided to do it beautifully, even in a place that would never notice. He set down his fork. Around him, the argument about grazing rights continued. Nobody had paused. Nobody had reacted. The basket had been passed and accepted, and the biscuits had been eaten with the same unconscious efficiency applied to the rest of the meal. Wyatt looked at the basket. He looked at the men around the table. He looked back at the basket. "Who baked these?" he asked. The argument paused. Several men looked at him with the expression people use when they cannot determine whether a question is serious. "The biscuits," Wyatt said, because he was not a man who repeated himself often, and he wanted it understood he was doing so now by choice. "Who made them?" A silence settled over the table that felt slightly larger than the room warranted. Then, one of the men, a broad, weathered ranch hand with a beard that had stopped being groomed sometime around 1880, jerked his head toward the back of the room, toward the kitchen door. "Girl back there," he said. "Just the kitchen girl." Just the kitchen girl. Wyatt turned to look at the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see a lamp burning and the shape of someone moving. Then the movement stopped. And in the stillness of that moment, through the narrow strip of space between the door and the frame, he could see her. She was standing completely still with a cloth in her hands, and her head turned slightly toward the dining room, as if she had heard something, or perhaps nothing. Perhaps she had simply sensed the strange weight of a silence that had occurred because of her. She looked surprised. That was what struck him most. Not nervous, not defensive, surprised. The expression of someone who had not expected to be noticed, who had perhaps stopped expecting it so long ago that the capacity for that particular surprise had begun to atrophy. He looked at her for exactly one moment. Then the door swung back to its original position, and she was gone behind it. Wyatt turned back to the table. "She bakes like that every night?" he asked. The bearded man shrugged. "Reckon so. Never thought about it." "Never thought about it," Wyatt repeated. He looked down at the remaining half of his biscuit and said nothing more. He told himself he was done with Red Hollow Station. He finished the meal paid. What was owed went upstairs, lay on the bunk with his hands folded on his chest, and stared at the ceiling with the calm, deliberate blankness of a man who has trained himself not to think about things he cannot immediately resolve. He was practical by nature. He dealt in animals and land and the measurable, manageable problems of ranch life. He was not a man who invented complications where none were required. But the question came anyway. Somewhere around midnight, in the particular silence when the station had gone quiet enough that a man couldn't outrun his own mind. Why does someone who can bake like that look that surprised when somebody notices it was not his concern? It was absolutely not his concern. He had a ranch to return to and a crew waiting on decisions he'd been too long in making. He had real problems, the kind with mud and muscle and money attached to them. How was asleep before he resolved anything? He was back at Red Hollow Station 6 days later. He told himself it was about supplies. He stayed for dinner. The biscuits were, if anything, better the second time. He had been wondering all week if his exhaustion had altered his judgment on the first tasting. If perhaps hunger and 6 weeks of trail food had lowered his standards enough that anything warm would have tasted extraordinary. They were not ordinary. I took 2 from the basket this time, and he ate them slowly, and he paid attention. Then he pushed back from the table and did something he had not done on the first visit. He walked to the kitchen door and knocked. There was a pause. A brief one, but a pause nonetheless, the sound of a small sound on the other side, like someone recalibrating. "Come in," said a voice. He opened the door. She was at the fire, stirring something, and she turned when he entered with an expression that moved through several stages in the span of a single second. First surprise. Then the quick smoothing of surprise into neutrality that suggested she had been practicing that transition for a long time. "Sir," she said. She was polite with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been trained to be polite to people regardless of what she thought of them. "Is something wrong with your meal?" "No," Wyatt said. He looked around the kitchen, smaller than he had imagined. Everything in it was arranged with a precision that spoke less of decoration than of necessity. When you had limited tools and limited space, you learned exactly where everything needed to be. "The biscuits," he said. She waited. "I wanted to tell you," he said. He was not accustomed to this kind of conversation, and he could hear the awkwardness in his own voice, which was not something he experienced often. "They're excellent." She stared at him, not rudely, not blankly. She stared at him the way a person stares when they have received information in a language they theoretically speak, but have not heard used in so long that the processing takes a moment longer than it should. "Thank you," she said finally. Her voice was careful, like she wasn't sure whether the words were safe to accept. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The wariness sharpened slightly behind her eyes. Not suspicion, more the instinct of someone who had learned that questions from certain people rarely stayed questions. 6 years, she said. He nodded. Where'd you learn to cook? My mother. She set down the spoon. Her posture had shifted slightly, not toward him, but not fully away. She had a boarding house in Ohio. I grew up helping her. Ohio, he said. Long way to Montana. Yes, she agreed. He waited to see if she would say more. She didn't. She had learned he suspected not to offer more than what was asked for. What's your name? He asked. Another pause. Briefer this time, but still there. Mabel, she said. Mabel Hartwell. He took off his hat, an automatic gesture, the kind of thing a man did without thinking when he finally understood that a room deserved more courtesy than he had been giving it. Wyatt Callahan, he said. My ranch is about 40 miles north of here, Callahan Ridge. She nodded, as if this information was interesting, but not immediately relevant to her life. The biscuits, he said again. The starter that's sourdough. Something shifted in her face. Just slightly. The wariness moved sideways, and something quieter and less armored appeared for a moment in its place. Yes, she said. My mother's starter. She kept it 22 years. I've had it for 3. 25 years, he said. That's a piece of history. Yes, Mabel said softly. It is. He stood there for another moment, holding his hat, aware that he had now been in this woman's kitchen for considerably longer than any legitimate errand required, and that he did not particularly want to leave. Thank you, he said again, and because he felt it needed saying one more time. You're the first person to ask, she said. The words came out quietly, almost as if she had not intended to say them aloud, and as soon as she did, she seemed to pull back slightly, the way you pull back when you've let something show that you normally keep private. He looked at her. At the steady, careful composure of a woman who had spent years making herself small enough to avoid causing trouble, and who had become so practiced at it that even her gestures had been compressed to the minimum necessary. He thought about the biscuits, about what it meant to do something that well, to carry that much care and skill and knowledge in a place that didn't even bother to ask your name. He put his hat back on. Well, he said, you should be asked more often. He went back to the dining room. He finished his meal. He paid and he left. But Mabel Hartwell stood in her kitchen for a long time after he walked out, and she held the cloth in her hands and didn't move. And she tried to understand why 2 words from a stranger she had never met felt heavier and more real than anything anyone at this station had said to her in 6 years. His 3rd visit to Red Hollow. Wyatt arrived in the afternoon and did not go directly to the dining room. He went to the supply area, which was adjacent to the kitchen, and he asked the man managing inventory about pricing on grain, which was a legitimate inquiry, and he stood close enough to the kitchen doorway to hear the sounds from inside. He heard Mabel's voice, calm and quiet, giving instructions to the younger boy who helped with deliveries. He heard the efficient, unhurried movement of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had learned to do it without wasting motion. And then he heard another voice. Harold Vickers. He had seen Vickers on his previous visits, a man of about 50, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had never had to back down in a room full of people who depended on him. He had the voice of a man who had discovered early in life that volume could be a substitute for correctness. Those portions were too large yesterday, Harold said. The sound carried clearly through the doorway. You're wasting my supplies. Mabel's response was quiet. Sir, the crew was larger by 4 men. The portions were proportionate. I know what my crew looked like, Harold said. Don't tell me what I saw in my own dining room. You want to argue with me? A pause. No, sir, Mabel said. Then less pork in the morning stew, and I'm docking you $25 for the week. Mr. Vickers. That's the end of it. Wyatt heard the sound of boots leaving. He stood by the supply shelves for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Then he set down the grain list he'd been holding and walked slowly away from the door and outside, where the late afternoon light was going gold across the yard. He stood in that light and breathed. I was not a man given to emotional reactions he couldn't name. He was practical. He was measured. People who knew him well would have described him as a man who thought before he moved, who required considerable evidence before he changed course, who did not make decisions based on feelings he couldn't justify to himself. But standing in that yard, listening to the dust, settle after Harold Vickers had walked away from a woman who had done nothing wrong. Wyatt Callahan felt something settle in him, with the specific quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision without entirely meaning to. He was going back inside. Not to the supply room. He knocked on the kitchen door again. She opened it herself this time. She had not been expecting him, that was clear from her face, and for a moment she simply looked at him, and he could see behind the composure she had pulled back into place, the raw edge of something she was working very hard to keep contained. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Wyatt," he said. I heard what he said. Her expression did not change, but something in her eyes went very still. "It's not your concern," she said. The words were flat and final, the way words are when they've been prepared in advance for situations like this. "No," he agreed. "But I'm making it my concern anyway." He put one hand against the doorframe, not blocking her, just steadying himself. "Does he do that often? Dock you for things that weren't your fault?" She looked at him steadily. Yes. The single word was extraordinary in its simplicity. No bitterness, no self-pity. Just the plain, exhausted truth of a woman who had decided a long time ago not to spend energy on things she couldn't change. "How much does he pay you?" Wyatt asked. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's not right," he said. "For everything you do here, what you produce, that's not right." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." "Then why are you still here?" She looked at him. The question was not unkind, but it was direct, and he watched her process it. It watched the layers of it move through her expression. "Because," she said carefully, "he told me nobody else would have me, and I believed him, for a long time. And now," she looked down at her hands, then back up, "now I'm less sure." Wyatt held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I need a cook at Callahan Ridge, a real one, someone who actually knows what they're doing." She was very still. "Not charity," he said before she could speak. "I don't offer charity. I need someone with skill, and you have it. More than anyone I've come across on the trail or off it." He paused. "Fair wages, real ones. You'd have the kitchen to yourself, nobody comes in without your say. It's a full crew, about 14 men, harder work than here, but the arrangement would be honest." Mabel looked at him. She looked at him for so long that the silence began to have weight, and Wyatt was the kind of man who could sit inside a weighted silence without flinching, so he waited. "Why?" she said. The word was quiet and real and not at all rhetorical. "Why me? You don't know me." "I know your biscuits," he said. "And I know what it means when someone puts that kind of care into something that nobody even bothers to notice. That tells me more about a person than most conversations do." She turned away from him slightly, and he watched her press her lips together and look out toward the fire, and he could see the war in her, the part of her that had learned to be cautious against the part of her that was perhaps very tired of being cautious. "I would need time," she said, "to think about it." "Take it," he said. "You'd have to give me a few days." "I'll be at the Gable posting station Thursday," he said. "Send word there if your answer is yes. If I don't hear from you, I'll understand." He put his hat on. He looked at her one more time, at the careful, contained, extraordinary woman standing in a kitchen that was too small for everything she was capable of, and he said, "Whatever you decide, Mabel, I want you to know something. What you do here matters, even if nobody in that dining room ever thought to say so." He left. She stood in the kitchen for a very long time. She looked at her starter, at the small bowl covered with cloth. The living thread between her and her mother and everything she had once believed her life might become, and she pressed one hand flat against the surface of the work table, and she breathed. In. Out. The way her mother had taught her. She made her decision slowly, the way she did everything with the full weight of her attention applied to it. She made it alone in the kitchen at night while everyone else slept. And on Thursday morning, she wrote a letter. 2 weeks later, Mabel Hartwell left Red Hollow Station at dawn. She did not tell Harold Vickers she was leaving until the morning of her departure. She told him simply without drama, looking him directly in the face the way she had not permitted herself to do in years, because there had never been a safe reason to. His reaction was exactly what she had expected. "You'll come back," he said. The certainty in his voice was absolute. "Nobody up there is going to put up with a woman running a kitchen her own way. You'll be back inside a month." Mabel looked at him. She thought about the pan she had thrown against the wall. She thought about 10 years of quiet fury, and 10 years of silence, and 10 years of a woman slowly convincing herself that invisible was the same thing as safe. "No," she said. "I won't." She picked up her bag. In it, wrapped carefully in cloth, and nested inside a small sealed crock, was her mother's sourdough starter. 25 years old. Still alive. She walked out of Red Hollow Station into the pale gold of a Montana morning, and she did not look back because she had learned a long time ago that looking back too long was how a person stopped moving forward. 40 miles north. Callahan Ridge waited, and for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Mabel Hartwell was walking toward something instead of simply standing still inside it. She didn't know what came next. She was afraid in the specific quiet way that people are afraid when they've decided to want something again, after a long time of not permitting themselves to want anything at all. But she was walking, and her starter was alive, and somewhere ahead of her, a man had asked a question that nobody else had thought to ask, and in asking it had reminded her of something she had almost allowed herself to forget entirely. That she existed, that she mattered, that the biscuits and everything they represented were worth someone stopping for. The 40-mile ride to Callahan Ridge took Mabel the better part of a day, and she spent most of it sitting straight in the wagon. She'd hired her bag on her lap, and her crock of starter wedged carefully between her feet, telling herself she had not made a mistake. She told herself this approximately 47 times. By the time the wagon rolled through the gate of Callahan Ridge Ranch, she had almost convinced herself it was true. The ranch hand who met the wagon at the gate was a young man named Buster, 19 years old, gap-toothed, with the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide what it was thinking. He looked at Mabel, looked at her bag, looked at the crock between her feet, and said, "You the new cook?" "I am," Mabel said. "Thank God," Buster said with a feeling so genuine it almost made her laugh. "The last man we had cooking burned the beans 3 nights running. I think he burned them on purpose just to get out of the job." He helped her down from the wagon, with the careful courtesy of someone who had been raised right and wasn't sure of the protocol, but was determined to do it correctly, and he carried her bag without asking, which she appreciated more than she showed. Wyatt was waiting at the kitchen door. He looked exactly as he had at Red Hollow Trail worn, direct, the kind of man who didn't rearrange his face for situations. He took off his hat when he saw her, which was the same instinctive gesture he'd made in her kitchen, and it struck her again the way it had the first time, as something automatic not performed. "You made it," he said. "I said I would," Mabel replied. Something moved briefly at the corner of his mouth. "You did." He showed her the kitchen. It was larger than Red Hollow's, considerably larger, with a real cast-iron range, instead of the open fire she'd been managing for 6 years, and shelves that went all the way to the ceiling, with enough room on them to actually organize things properly. There was a separate cold storage room, a dry goods cabinet that locked, and a window that faced east, so the morning light came in clean and early. Mabel stood in the center of it, and turned slowly, and did not say anything for a long moment. "It needs work," Wyatt said. He was leaning against the doorframe, watching her take inventory. "Previous cook left it in a state, but everything's here." "It's fine," Mabel said, and then, because she was trying to be accurate and not just polite, "It's better than fine. It's a good kitchen." "It's yours," he said simply. "Nobody comes in without asking you first. I already told the crew." She looked at him. "Did they listen?" "They will," he said in the tone of a man who was accustomed to things happening the way he said they would, not from arrogance, but from the plain experience of having earned the authority he carried. Mabel set her crock on the center of the work table. "I'll need to start the starter fresh," she said. "It needs to be fed after traveling, I won't have bread ready until day after tomorrow. Understood. Tonight I can do beans biscuits from dry starter salt pork if you have it. We have it. Then I'll need a full inventory of what's in that cold room and what's in the dry cabinet before I can plan the week. I'll have Buster bring you the list. She nodded. She was already moving, checking the range, testing the flue, opening the dry cabinet to assess what she was working with. Wyatt watched her for another moment. Then he said, "Mabel." She turned. "I'm glad you came," he said. Just that. No elaboration. She held his gaze for a moment. "I haven't decided yet if I am," she said honestly. "Ask me in a month." He almost smiled at that. She could see it the way it started, and then settled back into the steady, serious line of his face. "Fair enough," he said. He left her to her kitchen. She stood alone in it for exactly 30 seconds, breathing it in, letting herself feel the reality of being somewhere new. Then she put on her apron, and she got to work. The first week was harder than she expected. Not the cooking. She could have cooked for 40 in her sleep by that point. The cooking was the easiest part. What was hard was the crew. 14 men, ranging from Buster's 19 to a weathered old ranch hand named Gus, who claimed to be 62 and was probably closer to 70. They had varying degrees of manners, varying appetites, varying opinions about food that they expressed with varying degrees of consideration for the person responsible for making it. Most of them were fine. Some of them were better than fine. Buster, who thanked her for every single meal with the earnestness of a person who understood that gratitude was a real thing. Old Gus, who ate slowly and deliberately, and told her once without fanfare that her cornbread was the best he'd had since his wife passed. A quiet Mexican ranch hand named Tomas, who left the kitchen door open sometimes so she could hear the evening air, and who always brought back her water bucket without being asked. But there was one. His name was Clifton Reeves, and he had been at Callahan Ridge for 4 years, which in his own estimation gave him a certain standing that other people were expected to acknowledge. He was 38, lean and sharp-featured, with the particular habit of saying things at a volume just low enough to require plausible deniability. The first morning he looked at his breakfast plate, looked up at Mabel and said, "Huh. Different from what I'm used to." "I would hope so," Mabel said evenly, "given what I heard about the previous cook." A few men at the table made sounds. Buster hid something behind his coffee cup. Clifton looked at her with the flat, measuring expression of a man recalibrating. He didn't say anything else, but he watched her. Not the way Wyatt had watched her in the kitchen at Red Hollow, not with attention or curiosity, but with the watchful patience of someone waiting for a mistake to confirm what they'd already decided. She knew that watch. She had been watched that way for 6 years. She served his meals without adjusting anything about them, did not seek his approval, did not modify her behavior to accommodate his skepticism, and went about her work with the same efficient focus she applied to everything. But she felt it. Every day. The weight of being evaluated by someone who had already reached a verdict. On the 4th evening, Clifton was talking to 2 other hands near the stable. She wasn't trying to overhear. She was passing through the yard with a basket of dry goods, and his voice carried the way voices do in the early dark when sound moves differently. "She won't last a month," he was saying. "Wyatt brought her in for some reason that ain't about cooking, you ask me. Women like that, they come in, they start thinking they run the place, and then you got problems. Seen it before." One of the other men said something she couldn't hear. "I'm just saying," Clifton said. "Ranch kitchen ain't a place for a woman with opinions." Mabel kept walking. She did not stop. She did not adjust her pace or her posture or the set of her shoulders. She carried her basket across the yard and back into her kitchen, and she set it down on the table, and she stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. Her first instinct was the old one. Shrink. Work harder. Prove him wrong with silence and excellent meals, and never giving anyone a reason to look at her directly. Her second instinct, newer, shakier, less practiced, was something else entirely. She wasn't sure yet which one she was going to listen to. She fed her starter and went to bed. It was Wyatt who noticed something was off 3 days later. He came to the kitchen in the early afternoon, not for food, just to ask about the supply order she'd put together, and he found her at the work table, working with a focus so concentrated and so contained that it had its own specific quality, the quality of a person using work as a wall. He had seen that before at Red Hollow. The particular efficiency of someone who had learned to make themselves untouchable by being indispensable. He set down the supply list. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," she said. "Mabel." She looked up. He was looking at her with the same direct, undecorated attention he'd had from the beginning, and she found, as she had found each time, that it was harder to deflect than she expected. Most people looked at her and saw what they wanted to see. Wyatt looked at her and seemed to see what was actually there, which was considerably more unnerving. She set down her knife. "Clifton Reeves," she said. Wyatt's expression didn't change much, but something in it went quiet and focused. "What did he do?" "Nothing specific," she said. "Nothing I can point to. He's careful about that." But he's been waiting for me to fail since the first morning," she said. "And he's been talking to the other men." She paused. "I've heard it before. I know what it sounds like. He thinks I don't belong here, and he's going to keep believing that regardless of what I cook or how I run this kitchen, and I—" She stopped. "And," Wyatt said. "Wyatt." She looked at him. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I don't need you to fix it for me. I'm not asking you to go talk to him or warn him or make it easier. What I'm asking is—" She searched for the right words. "I need to know that when I handle it, you'll back me up. Not lead. Back me up." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Understood." Just that word. But the way he said it, level and absolute, made something in Mabel's chest release a tension she had been carrying since the fourth evening in the yard. "I'll handle it," she said. "I know you will," he said. He picked up the supply list and reviewed it, and they talked about the order for 10 minutes, as if the previous conversation had not happened, which was exactly the right thing to do. And Mabel found herself thinking that this man had a quality she had almost stopped believing existed in the world. He said what he meant, and then he stopped talking. It was remarkable how rare that was. She handled it on a Thursday. Clifton came into the kitchen in the mid-morning through the main door without knocking, moving with the casual confidence of someone who hadn't yet accepted that the rules had changed. Mabel was at the range. She heard the door, heard the boots, heard the pause that meant he'd registered she was there, and was deciding how to play whatever he'd come in to play. She did not turn around. "You need something," she said. "Just getting coffee," he said. "Coffee's in the dining room," she said. "This is my kitchen." A pause. "Wyatt don't usually lock the kitchen door. Wyatt doesn't lock it because the men who work here understand that when someone is working in a space you don't walk into it without asking." She turned around now, and she looked at him directly, and she kept her voice completely even. "Clifton, I've been here 2 weeks. You've decided in that time that I don't belong here, that I'm not qualified, and that whatever the reason I was hired, it probably wasn't about the cooking. I know because you said it in the yard Tuesday evening in sound carries." His face did something complicated. "So let me tell you something," she said. "I have been cooking for other people since I was 9 years old. I ran a kitchen feeding 20 travelers a day for 6 years by myself on wages that would have made your weekly pay look generous. I know every cut of meat on this ranch and what to do with each one. I know how to stretch provisions through a hard winter. I know how to keep 14 working men fed well enough that they work better because of it." She took one step forward, not aggressive, simply present. "I'm not here because someone did me a favor. I'm here because I'm the best cook within 100 miles, and Wyatt Callahan was smart enough to know it. You can decide that bothers you. That's your right. But if you walk into my kitchen again without asking, or if I hear you spreading your opinion about me to the other men, I will speak to Wyatt, and the conversation will not go the way you're hoping." Clifton stared at her. His jaw was working slightly the way jaws do when a man has several responses competing, and he can't decide which one won't make things worse. "You done?" he said finally. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that had shifted. "Coffee's in the dining room," Mabel said. "You're welcome to it." He left. Mabel turned back to the range and breathed slowly. Her hands were not shaking. She had half expected them to, But they weren't. She stood there in the quiet of her kitchen. Her kitchen, and she let herself feel for exactly one moment the very strange and not entirely comfortable sensation of having stood her ground in a way she had not in 6 years at Red Hollow permitted herself to do even once. It felt like something stretching back into shape after being compressed for too long. It hurt a little, but it was the right kind of hurt. Wyatt heard about it from Buster, who had witnessed the end of it from the dining room doorway and reported it to Wyatt that afternoon, with the breathless admiration of someone who had just watched something they didn't fully understand, but knew was significant. She looked right at him, Buster said, with the reverence of someone describing a natural phenomenon. Clifton Reeves, who I have personally seen make Harlan McCready back down just by looking at him. She looked right at him and she just talked, like she wasn't scared at all. Wyatt listened to this without comment. "Is she going to be okay?" Buster asked. "Clifton ain't the type to let things go easy." "She'll be fine," Wyatt said. "How do you know?" Wyatt thought about the woman he'd first seen through a kitchen doorway in Red Hollow, surprised that anyone had noticed her. He thought about the way she'd asked him why before she accepted anything. He thought about the way she'd told him this morning with complete calm that she would handle it herself. "Because she's been handling worse than Clifton Reeves for longer than he knows," Wyatt said. Buster considered this. "Huh," he said. "Yeah, reckon so." What happened next, nobody had quite planned for. It happened at dinner 3 days after the kitchen confrontation, and it was one of those moments that starts as something small and becomes something else before anyone in the room understands the shift has occurred. Mabel had made pot roast. Not a complicated dish, she hadn't tried to be impressive, she'd simply done it correctly, which meant low heat for a long time, and the right seasoning, and the understanding that a good pot roast required patience more than technique. The men ate. The room had the particular comfortable noise of people who are genuinely satisfied not talking about the food, just talking at ease in a way they hadn't quite been at the beginning of her 2 weeks when everything had still been adjustment and uncertainty. Old Gus at the far end of the table put down his fork and said to nobody in particular, "My Ellen made pot roast like this." The table went quiet, not uncomfortably, just the natural quiet of men who knew that Gus's wife had been gone 4 years and that he didn't mention her often. "How long were you married?" Mabel asked. She was still by the range, but she looked up when she spoke. Gus turned to look at her, as if surprised she'd been listening. Then something in his face softened in the way that old men's faces soften when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone finally just asks. 31 years, he said. "That's a long time to know someone," Mabel said. "Not long enough," Gus said simply. The table was quiet. Buster was looking at his plate. Tomas had his hands folded on the table with the stillness of someone in a church, and Clifton Reeves at the middle of the table was looking at Mabel with an expression that was not the expression he'd been wearing for 2 weeks. It wasn't warm exactly, but the flatness had changed into something less certain of itself. She served the second round, and the conversation moved on, but something had shifted in that room that was harder to name than a confrontation and harder to unhappen than an argument. She had not performed for them. She had not tried to be liked. She had simply asked, and listened, and treated an old man's grief as if it deserved to be treated. After dinner, when the men had gone and the kitchen was clean, Mabel sat at the work table with a cup of coffee and her sourdough starter, and she checked the starter's progress with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and she thought about the small specific weight of being seen. Not celebrated, not thanked, just seen. It was a quieter thing than she had imagined it would be. But it was also more than she had allowed herself to want for a very long time. Wyatt came to the kitchen late that night. She was still at the table. It was a habit she'd developed over the years, this late hour in the kitchen, when everything was clean and settled, and she had a few minutes that belonged entirely to herself. She heard his knock and said, "Come in," and he entered with 2 cups of coffee, which surprised her enough that she didn't speak for a moment. He set 1 cup in front of her, and sat on the stool on the other side of the work table, not across from her exactly. More at an angle the way people sit when they're not having an official conversation, but something that happens alongside one. Gus didn't talk about Ellen for 2 months after she passed, he said. Not once. Tonight's the first time I've heard him say her name at dinner. Mabel looked at her cup. He just needed someone to ask. Maybe, Wyatt said. Or maybe he needed someone to ask who actually wanted to know the answer. She looked up at that. He was looking at his coffee, not at her, which made it easier to hear. Clifton, she said. Is he going to be a problem? Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He might be. He doesn't back down from things easily. Neither do I, she said. I know. He looked up then. You know what I noticed about you the first time I came to your kitchen at Red Hollow? She waited. You had organized that kitchen to survive, he said. Not just to function, to survive. Every tool within reach. Every supply accounted for. Nothing wasted. Like someone who had learned that if they ran out of anything, nobody was going to replace it for them. He paused. That takes a particular kind of mind. The kind that keeps track because it has to, because the alternative is being caught without what you need. Mabel looked at him. That same mind, he said, is what I need running this ranch's provisions through a hard winter. You see things before they become problems. I've watched you do it for 2 weeks. You ordered more salt pork before I realized we were running low. You noticed the cold storage door wasn't sealing right and fixed it before anything spoiled. You know this ranch's needs better after 2 weeks than the previous cook knew them after a year. She was quiet. I'm telling you this, he said, because I don't think anyone has told you in a while that what you are is an asset, not a liability, not something to be tolerated, something that actually matters to how this place runs. Mabel pressed both hands around her coffee cup. She had heard compliments before. She had heard people say the food was good, or the kitchen was well run, or the meal was better than expected. Those compliments had always felt like receipts' acknowledgement of a transaction, nothing more. This was not that. This was someone describing her. The actual her, not what she produced, but how she thought, how she operated, the specific shape of how she moved through the world. She didn't know what to do with it. I'm not sure how to respond to that, she said honestly. You don't have to, he said. I just thought you should hear it. They sat in silence for a while. Not an uncomfortable silence, the kind of silence that happens between people when they have said the honest thing, and neither one feels the need to immediately bury it under more words. Mabel looked at her starter still in its crock on the table. My mother used to say, she said slowly, that the starter was the most honest thing in a kitchen. You can't fake it. Either you've been caring for it correctly, or you haven't. It knows. Wyatt looked at the crock. Has it always risen like that? Since I was 12, she said. She gave it to me when I turned 12 and said, this is older than you are, and it'll outlast both of us if you treat it right. And I thought she meant the starter. She paused. She didn't mean just the starter. Wyatt looked at her. She meant that things worth having, Mabel said, require consistent, honest care, not grand gestures, just steady daily showing up. She was quiet for a moment. I've been trying to remember that. Wyatt nodded slowly. So have I, he said. They finished their coffee. He stood and took his cup and said goodnight at the door, the same clean, undemonstrative way he did everything. And Mabel said goodnight back and listened to his boots cross the yard toward the main house. She sat alone in her kitchen for a long time after that. She thought about Red Hollow, about Harold Vickers and the biscuits in the dirt, and 10 years of a woman shrinking herself into the space someone else decided she was allowed to occupy. She thought about the kitchen at Callahan Ridge, with its good range, and its east-facing window, and its shelves that went all the way to the ceiling. She thought about Gus saying not long enough, and meaning it. She thought about Wyatt Callahan, who had walked into a kitchen through the wrong door one evening, and had almost by accident asked the one question that started all of it. Who baked these biscuits? She pressed her finger gently against the surface of the starter. Alive. Active. Still rising. She had come 40 miles carrying almost nothing, but she had carried the right things. She covered the crock with its cloth and turned down the lamp and went to bed. And for the first time in more years than she could cleanly count, she fell asleep without first running through everything she might have done wrong. The morning Clifton Reeves decided to make his move, Mabel was already 3 hours into her day. She had been up before dawn. Habit not necessity feeding the starter, checking the cold storage, calculating what she needed to pull from dry goods for the week. The ranch had a rhythm now, after a month, that she had learned the way you learn a person, not all at once, but in accumulated small moments, until one day you realize you understand them without having to think about it. She knew that Gus's hands hurt worst on cold mornings, and that he needed his coffee before he could manage conversation. She knew that Buster ate fast when he was anxious about the day's work, and slow when things felt manageable. She knew that Tomas prayed quietly before breakfast always, and that the other men had silently begun to wait until he finished, before they started eating, without anyone ever saying a word about it. She knew that Wyatt took his coffee black and his meals without complaint, and that the only way you could tell when he was satisfied was the brief pause he allowed himself between the last bite and pushing back from the table, a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds. No more, like a man permitting himself a small private moment of rest before returning to the next thing. She had learned all of this in a month. She had also learned that Clifton had not let go of anything. He had become more careful was all. After the kitchen confrontation, he'd stopped making comments within her earshot. He stopped sending his complaints through the back channel of other men's casual conversation. He ate his meals without visible objection and brought his plate to the basin without being asked, and to the casual observer would have appeared to be a man who had accepted the new arrangement. Mabel was not a casual observer. She could feel it in the way he moved through the dining room, the particular posture of a man who was waiting, not yielding. She noticed the way he watched Wyatt when Wyatt spoke to her, cataloging every exchange with the patience of someone building a case. She noticed which men Clifton spent the most time with in the evenings, and she noticed, more importantly, which of those men had begun to look at her just slightly differently than they had in the first 2 weeks. How was working? Quietly, carefully over time. The way water works on rock. She knew the method. She had been on the receiving end of it for 6 years. So when Buster came into the kitchen on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and his face arranged in the specific uncomfortable configuration of someone carrying news they didn't want to carry, she already knew approximately what she was about to hear. "Something happened," she said before he could speak. "Yeah," Buster said. "Clifton told a couple of the men last night that he seemed to be wrestling with how to say it, that the reason Wyatt hired you wasn't about cooking. That Wyatt's being, not thinking clearly, on account of you." He looked at the floor. "He used words that weren't, he wasn't respectful." Mabel set down the bowl she was holding. Slowly, carefully. The way you set down something you don't want to break. "Which men?" she asked. "Harlan and Pete. Maybe Dale, I'm not sure. Did any of them disagree with him?" Buster's silence was its own answer. She looked at him. He was 19 years old and visibly distressed about being in this room right now, and she could see that the distress was genuine, that he had come to her not because someone told him to, but because he had decided on his own that she should know. That small voluntary act of loyalty from a 19-year-old boy with a gap-toothed face hit her harder than she expected. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to finish making breakfast," she said. "And then I'm going to think about what happens next." He nodded like this was wisdom, and he left. Mabel stood in her kitchen alone. She breathed in, breathed out. She was very, very angry. Not the hot, cracking anger of the pan she'd thrown at Red Hollow. That had been the anger of helplessness, of rage, with nowhere to go. This was something colder and more deliberate. The anger of a woman who had a kitchen that was hers, and men who had begun to trust her, and a life she had chosen with open eyes, and who was absolutely not going to allow Clifton Reeves to quietly dismantle it with whispered insinuations in the dark. She finished making breakfast. She served it without a word out of place. And then she went to find Wyatt. Howe was at the stable when she found him working alongside Tomas on something with the tack that required both their hands, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway with the expression of a man who could read weather accurately. "Give me 5 minutes," he said to Tomas. Tomas gave Mabel a brief neutral look as he passed, not unfriendly, just careful, and she thought he already knows. Which meant it had spread further than Buster realized. Wyatt came to her. They stood outside the stable in the thin autumn light, and Mabel told him exactly what Buster had told her in plain language without softening it. His face went very still in a way she had come to understand was not blankness, it was concentration. The face of a man deciding where to put something before he responded to it. "He's saying things about you," Wyatt said. "By implication, he's saying things about me." "Yes," she said. "And you want to handle it the same way you handled it before," he said. "Yourself." "No," she said, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, she thought, genuine surprise. "This one I need you for, but not the way you might think." He waited. "I don't need you to defend me," she said. "I need you to let me say what needs to be said in front of everyone, at dinner. And I need you to be there, and I need you to let it happen without stepping in." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a significant ask." "I know. If it goes wrong." "It won't," she said. "But if it does, I'll accept the consequences. This is my problem, Wyatt. Clifton doesn't believe I belong here because I'm a woman with authority in a space where he thinks women shouldn't have authority. The only way to end that is to make it visible. All of it. In the open, where everyone can see it." How was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it, not looking for reasons to say no, she understood, but looking for the version of yes that was most honest. "All right," he said. "You'll stay out of it." "Unless you need me to step in," he said. "If you need me, I'm there. But I won't lead." She looked at him. She thought about the sourdough starter, about things that required consistent, honest care, about a man who kept saying the exact right thing and then stopping. "That's all I needed," she said. She chose dinner because the whole crew would be there, all 14 men as they were. Every evening settled into their chairs with the comfortable familiarity of a month's routine. The meal she had made was good. It was always good. But tonight she had done something she hadn't done before. She had made a proper roast chicken, the kind that required most of the day, with herbs from her kitchen garden, and a gravy that she had been tending since mid-afternoon. She had made apple cake for after. She had set everything out with an attention to detail that was, even by her standards, elevated. She had done it deliberately. If tonight was the night she made everything visible, she wanted there to be no ambiguity about what Callahan Ridge would lose if it lost her. Wyatt sat at the head of the table. He had not said anything to the crew. His expression was its usual, even attentive quality, giving nothing away. The men were halfway through dinner when Mabel came out of the kitchen. She didn't stand in the doorway. She came fully into the dining room, which she rarely did once service was underway, and she stood at the near end of the table and waited until the conversation tapered and the men looked at her. "I have something to say," she said. "I'm going to say it once, and then we're not going to talk about it again." The table went quiet, with the specific quality of quiet that happens when people suddenly understand this is not casual. She looked directly at Clifton. Howe was sitting 4 men down on her left, and she saw the moment he registered where her gaze had landed, saw the way his jaw shifted slightly, the first genuine crack in his composure in weeks. "Since I arrived at this ranch," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, and did not apologize for taking up space in the room. "Someone at this table has been working to convince the men here that I don't belong. That the reason I was hired had nothing to do with my ability to do my job. That Wyatt Callahan, who has built this ranch through 14 years of honest work, made a decision based on something other than judgment." Nobody moved. "I'm not going to tell you who it is," she said, "because you all know, and the ones who don't know enough to understand what I'm describing." She saw Harlan look at his plate. She saw Pete go very still. "Here's what I want to say to that," she continued. "I ran a kitchen at Red Hollow Station for 6 years on wages that barely covered my meals. I cooked for strangers who never learned my name. I maintained a provision system, managed a fire range that was 20 years past, needing replacement, and produced meals that kept that station running on a budget that Harold Vickers docked every time he felt like it." She paused. "I did all of that alone. I've been doing this my whole life. I'm not here because someone was doing me a kindness. I'm here because I applied for a job that needed to be filled, and I was the best person to fill it." She shifted her gaze from Clifton to the rest of the table, moving slowly, deliberately, meeting eyes. "Every one of you has eaten better in the past month than you did before I came. I know that because Buster told me, and because Gus told me, and because I have eyes, and I can see when men eat well and when they don't." A small, genuine breath. "I'm not asking you to like me. I'm asking you to extend me the same basic professional respect you would extend to any person in this position, which is that my ability to do my job is the only thing that's relevant to my being here. Full stop." She looked at Clifton one more time. "If that's not something you can manage," she said quietly, "then the problem is yours, not mine, and not Wyatt's." She turned and walked back into the kitchen. Behind her, the dining room was completely silent. She stood at her range, and she breathed slowly and deliberately, and she waited. She heard Wyatt's voice, not the words, just the tone, low and measured. Then she heard Clifton's voice, shorter than she expected. Then nothing. Then the sound of the table resuming carefully at first. Then, with increasing normalcy, the way things returned to movement after a shock. Buster came to the kitchen pass-through 10 minutes later with his plate scraped clean and his expression one of undisguised awe. "Clifton left," he said. "Got up and went to the bunkhouse without finishing his meal." "All right," Mabel said. "Wyatt didn't say anything to him," Buster said. "He just let him go." "Yes," she said. "That's right. Harlan and Pete both had seconds," Buster added. "And Dale, and Harlan never has seconds. He's been here 4 years, and I have never once seen that man take a second serving of anything." Despite herself, despite the adrenaline still working its way out of her system, Mabel felt the corner of her mouth move. "Good," she said. "There's apple cake." Wyatt came to the kitchen after the men had gone. He knocked, which he always did now. She said "come in," which she always did. He sat on the stool, and she poured him coffee, without being asked, which had become its own kind of language between them. The small, unprompted gestures that accumulate between people who are paying attention to each other. "Clifton will ask to leave," he said. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe the end of the week, but he'll ask." "Will you let him?" she asked. "Yes," he said simply. He made a choice about what kind of place he wanted this to be. "That's not the choice I'm making." She nodded. "And the others, Harlan and Pete?" "They'll be fine," Wyatt said. "They followed Clifton because they didn't have a reason not to yet. Now they have one." She turned that over in her mind. "The apple cake," she said finally. Something in his expression shifted into something so close to a real smile that she registered it as one. "The apple cake," he agreed. "You planned that." "I always know what I'm doing," she said. And then, because honesty was something she had decided to practice the way she practiced bread daily, without excuses, she said, "I was afraid before I came out there." "I know," he said. "Did it show?" "Not to them," he said, "but to you." He looked at her. "I was watching for it," he said. "They weren't." She thought about that, about what it meant to be watched by someone who was looking for your fear, not to exploit it, but to understand it. To see you fully, including the parts that shook, and stay in the room. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything," he said. She had noticed he always said this, and always meant it. "Why do you keep coming to the kitchen at night?" I was quiet for a moment. Not avoiding it, she had learned the difference between Wyatt Callahan avoiding something, and Wyatt Callahan actually thinking before he spoke. He was thinking. "Because," he said, "it's the only room on this ranch where somebody is honest about things." She looked at him. "I run 14 men and a property, and every day there's somebody who wants something from me or needs a decision from me or is waiting for me to tell them what to do. That's the job, and I don't mind it." He turned his coffee cup slightly. "But in here you say what you mean. You said it to Clifton tonight, and you said it to me the first week, and you said it about your mother's starter at midnight, and you say it about what needs to be ordered before we run low." He paused. "I come in here because this is the room where things are what they actually are. Mabel was quiet for a long time. "Wyatt," she said finally. "Yeah, I need you to understand something," she said. "I spent 6 years becoming very small. Not small in a way that shows not. I was still working, still capable, still doing everything that needed doing. But small inside, in the way I thought about myself, in what I allowed myself to expect from a day." She set down her cup. "I am not fully done with that. I catch myself some mornings still running. The old calculations, is this too much, is this allowed? Allowed what happens if I take up too much space. I don't want you to think I've come here already whole because I haven't." He looked at her steadily. "I'm working on it," she said. "But I want you to know that it's work. That some days it still costs me something." He leaned forward slightly and he said, "Mabel, I'm not waiting for you to be finished." She heard it. She let herself hear it, which was different from just receiving it. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay," he said. They sat in silence for a while, the comfortable kind, the kind with nothing threatening inside it and outside. The wind had begun to pick up in the way that meant weather was coming, and somewhere in the yard, one of the horses moved and settled, and the lamp between them burned with the steady, uncomplicated commitment of something that had no interest in burning any other way. Mabel looked at her starter on the shelf. Still rising. Still honest. Still exactly what it had always been. The twist came 9 days later, and it came from a direction she had not seen. It arrived in the form of a letter. Buster brought it to her from the posting station during his morning run into town, along with the supplies she'd requisitioned, and he handed it over without any particular expression, because he hadn't looked at the return address and therefore had no idea. Mabel looked at the return address. Her hands went still. The letter was from Red Hollow Station, not from Harold Vickers. The handwriting was a woman's precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who had learned in a formal setting, and then spent years writing quickly because time was never plentiful. She opened it standing in the kitchen. "Miss Hartwell." It began, "My name is Clara Vickers. I am Harold Vickers' daughter. I believe you knew my father." She knew Clara Vickers. She knew her as a child who came to the station on school holidays and ate Mabel's biscuits and said thank you, and seemed in the muted way of children raised by Harold Vickers to be someone worth more than her circumstances. She read on. "My father passed 7 weeks ago from a fever that moved fast. In settling his accounts, I discovered certain records that concern you. Specifically, I found that my father had been systematically withholding a portion of your wages beyond what he noted in the official ledger. An amount that across 6 years represents a figure I find deeply troubling." Mabel's hands gripped the paper. "I am not in a position to make full restitution at this time, as the estate is encumbered by debt. But I am writing to tell you that I know what was done, and I am sorry. I also need to tell you something else because I believe you deserve to know it." She kept reading. "Before he died, my father told me that he had driven away the best worker he ever had. He did not say it as an apology. My father was not a man who apologized. He said it the way he said most truths, which was sideways and quickly, and as if it were someone else's fault. But he said it. He said your name. He said he'd been telling you for years that you were replaceable, and that he knew the whole time it wasn't true." Mabel set the letter down on the work table. She stood in her kitchen, and she looked at the window, where the morning light was coming in clean and east-facing the way she had loved it from the first day, and she breathed. Harold Vickers, who had thrown her biscuits in the dirt, who had docked her wages for imaginary failures, who had looked at her for 6 years and told her in words and in silence, and in every small daily humiliation, that she was nothing more than what he decided she was. He had known the whole time. The thing she had suspected in her clearest moments, but had never been able to hold on to that. The smallness Harold put on her was something he chose to put there, not something that was true. It had been confirmed from a direction she never expected by a woman named Clara, who had settled her father's accounts and found something she could not in conscience keep to herself. She sat down. She sat very still. She had spent 6 years wondering if she was imagining it. Wondering if she really was as unremarkable as Harold made her feel. wondering if the voice that said, "You're better than this," was vanity rather than truth. She had spent 6 years being systematically made smaller by a man who knew the entire time that she was not small. The grief and the fury and the strange aching relief of it moved through her simultaneously, and she sat with all of them, and she did not try to sort them into the right order. She read the rest of the letter. Clara was asking for nothing. She wanted no response, she said, unless Mabel chose to give one. She had enclosed a partial accounting of what had been withheld. It was written in her father's own hand, in a separate ledger, meticulous and damning in its precision. And she said simply that whatever Mabel chose to do with it was her own business, and that she hoped Mabel had found a better situation, and that she believed she deserved one. Mabel sat with the letter and the ledger page for a long time. Then she folded them carefully and put them in the tin box she kept on the shelf next to her mother's recipe cards, which was where she kept the things that mattered and needed to be held safely. She would decide what to do with the information later. Maybe nothing. Maybe something. That was a question for a different day. What she understood right now in this morning, in this kitchen, was this: she had been right. She had been right about herself when everyone around her was working to make her wrong, and she had held on to it imperfectly, painfully, at considerable cost, and she was still holding it. That was not a small thing. That was perhaps the largest thing. She stood up. She went to her starter. She fed it with the careful, practiced motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and understood that the simple act of showing up consistently was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. She was still standing there, her hands warm from the starter, when she heard Wyatt's knock at the kitchen door. "Come in," she said. He came in and stopped. She turned to look at him. She was aware that her face was doing something she had less control over than usual, that whatever she had processed in the last hour was still visible in it, the way things are visible when you've been alone with them and haven't yet had time to arrange your expression. He saw it immediately. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 6 years, about Harold's ledger, about Clara's careful handwriting and the sideways truth a dying man had told his daughter about a woman he had spent years trying to convince was worthless. She said, "I got a letter this morning." He waited. "From Red Hollow," she said. "Harold Vickers died 7 weeks ago." Something moved through his expression. He did not say he was sorry because he understood enough about what Harold Vickers had been to know that was not the response the situation required. "His daughter wrote to me," Mabel continued. "She found records. He'd been taking more than he admitted, more than I knew." She paused. "And apparently before he died, he told her I was the best worker he ever had." Wyatt was very still. "He knew," she said. The words came out plain and level, but they cost her something. "The whole time, Wyatt. He knew what I was worth, and he spent 6 years making sure I didn't know it." A long silence. "I'm sorry," Wyatt said. And he meant it in the specific way that sorry means something not as a formality, but as an acknowledgement of the actual weight of the actual thing. "I'm not," she said, and then she paused, considering it honestly. "I'm angry, but I'm not sorry, because if he hadn't—" She stopped, looked at her starter, looked back at him. "If Red Hollow had been different, I wouldn't have needed to leave. And if I hadn't left—" She didn't finish the sentence. He looked at her across the work table, across the bowl of starter, and the flour, and the organized reality of the kitchen she had made her own, and he said nothing. But she saw it in his face, the same thing she'd been feeling since she read the letter. That some things cost you enormously, and lead you somewhere that couldn't have been reached any other way. That the path from the dirt-thrown biscuits to this kitchen, to this morning, to this man standing in the room where things were what they actually were, that path was ugly and long and full of real damage. And it had still brought her here. She breathed. "I need to start the bread," she said. "I know," he said. "Will you stay?" she asked. The question surprised her slightly. She hadn't planned it. But she had started, she'd realized, to be honest, the way she breathed, without always deciding to. He settled onto the stool without a word. She turned to her dough, and behind her she could feel the simple, solid presence of a man who had asked a question through a wrong door and had not since that evening stopped paying attention. Her hands moved in the flour. The starter rose. And for the first time in a very long time, Mabel Hartwell felt not like a woman surviving a life, but like a woman living one. Clifton Reeves asked to leave on a Friday morning. He came to Wyatt before breakfast hat in hand, and said he'd found work at another spread 2 counties over and reckoned it was time to move on. He didn't look at Mabel when he said it. He didn't look at much of anything except the middle distance, the way men look when they've made a decision. They can't quite bring themselves to call a defeat. Wyatt paid him what he was owed, shook his hand, and said he wished him well. He meant it, which was the kind of man Wyatt was. He could wish a person well and mean it even when that person had made the previous 2 months harder than they needed to be. He had told Mabel once that holding on to anger about a thing that was already resolved cost more than it returned, and she had looked at him when he said it and thought, I want to believe that. I'm not there yet, but I want to be. Clifton's horse was out of the yard before the morning meal was on the table. Mabel heard the hooves, and she stood in her kitchen, and she did not feel triumphant. She had expected to maybe. She had earned it by most reasonable measures. But what she actually felt was simpler and quieter than triumph. It was the feeling of a room after a window that had been stuck finally opens. Not dramatic, just air. Just the absence of something that had been blocking it. She finished making breakfast. The men ate with a different quality that morning. It was hard to name exactly. Nothing was said about Clifton, not at the table, not while she was present, but there was a looseness to the room that had not been there before. Harlan, who had followed Clifton's lead in his watchful silence for 2 months, said please and thank you twice, and passed the biscuit basket to Tomas without being asked. Buster ate slowly, which meant he was feeling good about the day. Old Gus, at the end of the table, looked up when Mabel refilled his coffee and said, "Morning like this deserves a good breakfast." "That's why I made one," she said. He almost smiled. For Gus, that was the same as a standing ovation. After the men had gone out to their work and the kitchen was being cleaned, Wyatt appeared in the doorway. "How are you?" he asked. She had come to understand that when Wyatt asked this, he actually wanted to know, and that the correct response was the honest one. "Relieved," she said. "And a little strange about it." "Strange how?" She wrung out her cloth and draped it over the basin edge. "Like I've been bracing for something for so long that I don't know quite what to do with my shoulders now that it's over." He leaned against the doorframe. "Give it a day," he said. "Your shoulders will figure it out." She looked at him. "Wyatt?" "Yeah." "Thank you," she said, "for staying out of it when I asked you to. I know that wasn't easy." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't." "Why did you do it?" He considered this. "Because you asked me to, and because you were right." He paused. "And because I've spent 14 years being the one who handles things on this ranch, and it occurred to me watching you that maybe I'd gotten too accustomed to thinking that meant I had to handle everything." He looked at her directly. "You didn't need handling. You needed room." Mabel pressed her lips together. She had spent 6 years at Red Hollow being given no room. She had spent the last 2 months at Callahan Ridge, learning what it felt like when someone deliberately stepped back to give you space to occupy. The contrast was so large, she still hadn't fully measured it. "I'm going to need more of it," she said. "Room. As things," she paused, searching for the right word, "develop." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "That's all right." She nodded. He left. She picked up her cloth and went back to work, and the warmth in her chest from that particular exchange was something she folded carefully and put away to be examined honestly later when she had the privacy to do it properly. October came into Montana without apology. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 3 days, and the wind acquired an edge that meant business, and Mabel discovered that feeding 14 men through the beginning of a hard autumn required a complete rethinking of what she was producing and how. The summer meals, lighter faster built for heat, needed to become something else entirely. Heavier. More sustaining. The kind of food that built warmth from the inside out, that sent men into cold work, feeling fortified rather than merely full. She spent 2 days reorganizing her provisions thinking, and another day in conversation with Gus, who had more winters at Callahan Ridge than anyone, and who knew better than any supply ledger what the body needed when the temperature did what it was about to do. "The beans," Gus said when she asked. "Everyday beans. You don't have to fancy them up. Men working in cold like beans because they stay with you." "I know," she said. "What else?" "Wyatt keeps a good store of dried corn. His mother used to make hominy in winter. The men who've been here long enough remember it, and the ones who haven't will learn to." "I can do hominy," she said. "Do you know her recipe?" Gus looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something old in it, and careful. "Wyatt might," he said. She let that sit. That evening, she found Wyatt at the desk in the main room, the room she rarely entered, understanding without being told that it was his private space, the place where the business of the ranch lived, and she knocked on the open door frame. He looked up. "Your mother's hominy," she said. "Gus says she made it in winter. If you have her recipe, I'd like to use it, but only if that's all right." Something moved through Wyatt's face that she watched without trying to interpret, something private that passed through quickly like a cloud. "I have it," he said. He opened the drawer beside the desk and produced a small card worn at the edges with handwriting on it that was nothing like his looped and generous, the handwriting of a woman who had learned it as something worth doing well. He held it out. She crossed the room and took it. She looked at the card. Then she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it simply, not as a performance, as information. Mabel looked back at the card. "How do you know?" "Because she didn't have much patience for small," he said. "And you're not." She stood in the middle of his private room, holding his mother's recipe card, and she thought that this moment, this specific, quiet, unremarkable moment, was one of those things she would remember exactly. Not because anything dramatic had happened in it, but because something true had been said without flinching, and she had been present enough to receive it. "I'll take good care of it," she said, meaning the card. "I know," he said, meaning more than that. Or maybe meaning exactly that. With Wyatt, the words and the thing behind them were usually the same. She went back to her kitchen. She made the hominy for the first time 2 days later, following his mother's card with the same respect she gave her own mother's recipes. And when she brought it to the table, the oldest hands, the ones who had been at Callahan Ridge longest, went quiet in the specific way people go quiet when food returns them somewhere they weren't expecting to go. Gus set down his spoon after the first bite and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, and nobody said anything. Then Tomas said quietly, "This is very good, Miss Mabel." And the spell broke, and the table resumed its comfortable noise, and Mabel stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, and felt something she was slowly learning to simply accept, rather than question. She belonged here, not because she had been permitted to belong, not because she had survived long enough and worked hard enough that exclusion had become impractical. Because she had built something real in this place, and real things belonged where they were built. It was a different kind of knowing than she'd had before. The first serious snow came on a Thursday 11 days into October, and it came fast. Mabel had felt it building, not in any mystical way, but in the practical way of someone who paid attention to the quality of morning air and the behavior of the fire, and the way the cold storage temperature had been dropping more sharply than the calendar strictly accounted for. She had spent the 2 days prior quietly increasing her provisions, adding an extra barrel of flour to her stores, doubling her bean supply, pulling in the dried corn from the outer storage to the kitchen pantry where it would be closer to hand. Nobody had told her to do any of this. She had simply looked at what was coming and done the math. When the snow hit and the men came in from the yard with ice on their coats, and the urgency of people who'd been caught mid-task by something that changed the parameters, the kitchen was ready. The range was fully stoked. The beans were already on. The bread had been baked that morning in double portions. There was hot coffee and hot water and enough food to sustain 14 men through a full day of hard work without anyone having to think about it. Wyatt came through the kitchen in the first hour of the storm, moving fast, already directing men to the cattle and the water lines. And he stopped when he registered what he was looking at. He looked at the extra flour, the doubled stores, the pre-baked bread. He looked at Mabel. "When?" he said. 2 days ago," she said. "The air had a particular quality Tuesday morning." He stared at her for a moment. 2 days ago, I was still thinking we had a week. The air didn't agree, she said. I made a sound half breath, half something else and said, "What do you need from me?" Nothing, she said. Go deal with the cattle. I have this. He went. She ran her kitchen through the storm with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone who had been trained by necessity to function under pressure without allowing the pressure to change the quality of the work. She fed the men in shifts as they came in from outside, cold and tense and depleted, and she had something hot ready every time. She managed her fire with the conserving intelligence of someone who had learned at Red Hollow that resources were finite and panic was expensive. In the late afternoon, a pipe on the north side of the kitchen building burst a sharp crack, and then water, and Mabel had the store of flour moved to the dry side of the kitchen in 3 minutes, working alone before the water reached it. Buster found her repositioning the last barrel and rushed to help. "You should have called somebody," he said, breathless. "There wasn't time," she said. "And I didn't need anyone. Grab that end." They moved the barrel together. "How did you know to move it that direction and not the other?" he asked when it was done. She looked at him. "Because the floor slopes east and water follows gravity. I checked the floor slope my first week." Buster blinked. "You checked the floor slope your first week." "I check everything my first week," she said. "It's how I know what's coming before it arrives." He looked at her with an expression she had started to recognize, half admiration, half the particular confusion of someone revising a mental category they didn't know they'd built. "Mabel," he said, and then stopped. "Yes," she said. "You're not just a cook, are you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. She picked up her cloth. "I'm exactly a cook," she said. "I've just had to be everything else, too." The storm lasted 2 days. When it broke, the damage to the ranch was real, but manageable 3 fence sections down the waterline. On the east pasture needed clearing. 2 cattle had to be brought in from exposure. It could have been significantly worse. Wyatt spent the morning after the storm walking the property with the senior hands assessing. When he came back to the kitchen for the midday meal, he sat down at the table, not the crew table, but the kitchen work table, where he had been sitting most evenings, which had become its own statement about where he chose to be, and he told her what he'd found. She listened. Asked specific questions about the east fence and the waterline timing. Made 2 suggestions about the cold storage that he wrote down. When she was done, he looked at her across the table. "Mabel," he said. "Wyatt," she said back because she had also started doing this small dry echo, and she'd noticed he noticed it. "The flour," he said. "Moving it before the pipe burst. The provisions doubled before the storm. The floor slope." He paused. "How long have you been running this ranch?" She met his eyes. "About 6 weeks," she said. He leaned back slightly and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The same gesture she'd seen from Gus over the hominy, she realized. Men at Callahan Ridge looked at the ceiling when something was more than they had a quick word for. Then he looked back at her. "I need to ask you something," he said. The change in his tone was slight, but she felt it the shift from their ordinary back and forth into something with more weight in it. "And I need you to take your time with the answer." She set down her cup. "All right. I've been thinking," he said, "about the ranch, about what it needs going forward, about winter and next spring and the 2 years after that." He was choosing his words carefully. She could see at the same precision he brought to everything. Nothing wasted. "I've been running this operation as a single set of hands at the top, which works until it doesn't. This storm showed me a few things about where the gaps are, about what I've been carrying alone that shouldn't be carried alone." She waited. "I want to bring you in on the provisioning decisions," he said, formally, not as my cook who I ask advice from occasionally, as someone with real say over how this ranch manages its resources. That's food cold storage supplies, but it's also the thinking behind it. The kind of thinking you did before this storm." He paused. "I want to pay you accordingly. Different wage, different title if you want one, and a share in the decisions." The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel sat with the offer. She was aware of her own reaction moving through her in layers. The first layer, which was pure startled disbelief. The instinct formed at Red Hollow that said things like this do not happen to you. The second layer, which was the newer, steadier voice, saying yes they do, and you earned this. And the third layer underneath both of those, which was something she identified after a moment as something close to fear. Not of the responsibility, of wanting it, of how much she already wanted it before he finished asking. She had learned over years to protect herself from wanting things too specifically, because wanting things specifically meant that when they didn't happen, and they usually didn't, or they were taken away, or there was a Harold Vickers attached to them who would use the wanting as leverage, the loss was proportionally large. She had gotten very good at generalizing her desires, at wanting only broadly, at not letting herself want this thing, exactly this much. Wyatt was watching her. He wasn't pressing. He was simply there the way he was always simply there, present without pushing, attentive without crowding. "You said to take my time," she said. "I meant it." "I need to ask you something first," she said. "Ask." She looked at him directly. "Is this because of the storm? Because I was useful and you're reacting to it in the moment?" He didn't look away. "No. I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks. The storm confirmed it. It didn't create it." 3 weeks, she said. "That's before Clifton left." "Yes." "You were planning this while he was still actively trying to make my position here untenable." "Yes," he said. "Because his opinion of your position here was not relevant to my assessment of your value to this operation. It never was." She pressed both hands flat on the table. She thought about Harold Vickers, who had known her value for 6 years and used the knowing as a weapon against her. She thought about what it meant that the man across this table had known it for 3 weeks and had been sitting with it quietly waiting for the right moment to say it plainly. They were not the same thing. They were, in fact, opposite things. "Yes," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "Yes, you'll do it, or yes, you're still thinking." "Yes, I'll do it," she said. "I'm done thinking." Something shifted in his face, not dramatic, not performed the quiet change of a man who had hoped for a particular answer and received it, and was allowing himself to register that without making it a spectacle. "Good," he said. "I have conditions," she said immediately. His mouth moved. "Of course you do. The kitchen stays mine, completely. The provisioning decisions are mine to make and bring to you, not yours to make and inform me of." "Agreed." "I want it in writing. Not because I don't trust you, I do, but because written agreements protect both parties, and I've learned not to rely on the goodwill of verbal arrangements." "Also agreed," he said, and she saw in his expression that he understood exactly what that condition was built from and respected it rather than taking offense. "And I want to be in the room when you talk to the hands about it," she said. "I don't want it announced on my behalf. I want to be present." He nodded slowly. "Tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow morning," she confirmed. He stood. He was heading for the door back to the post-storm work that still needed doing, and she was already turning back to the range, and then he stopped. "Mabel," he said. She turned. He stood in the kitchen doorway. The same doorway he'd stood in that first morning at Red Hollow. The wrong door he'd walked through by accident, and he looked at her with the same direct, undecorated attention he'd had from the beginning, only without any of the distance. "Thank you," he said. "For the flour, for the doubled stores, for the floor slope." He paused. "For all of it." She looked at him. She thought about the pan she'd thrown at the wall, about the letter in her tin box, about 25 years of sourdough starter still rising on her shelf, about 40 miles of road she had driven toward something instead of away from something for the first time in longer than she could cleanly remember. "Thank you," she said back. "For the wrong door." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she would spend a long time thinking about later in the quiet of the kitchen, when the lamp was low and the starter was covered and the ranch was sleeping around her. Then he went back to work, and she went back to hers. And the space between those two facts, the fact of him, the fact of her, the fact of this kitchen and this ranch and this specific unlikely real thing they were building, that space had been shrinking day by day with the slow and honest consistency of something that knew exactly what it was becoming and wasn't in any hurry to be mistaken about it. The morning she stood in front of the crew and heard Wyatt introduce her new role, Mabel stood straight and kept her eyes level and did not look at the floor even once. Wyatt was brief and plain about it, which was how he was about everything. He said that Mabel Hartwell was taking on formal responsibility for ranch provisioning and resource management, that her decisions in that domain carried his full authority, and that he expected the same professional respect from the crew that they would give to any other person in a position of formal responsibility. He said it the way he said most things once, clearly, without embellishment. Then he looked at her. She looked at the men. At Buster, who was grinning with the gap-toothed enthusiasm of someone watching history happen. At Tomas, who gave her a single slow nod that carried more weight than a speech. At Harlan and Pete, who looked like men who had completed a calculation and arrived at a sum they could live with. At old Gus, who was looking at his coffee cup with the deliberate attention of someone who was feeling something he wasn't going to display publicly. "I know most of you," she said. "I know what you eat and how much and what it means to your day. That's not changing." She paused. "What's changing is that this ranch's resources are going to be managed with more intention than they have been, and I'm going to be the person doing that managing. If you have concerns about provisions or supplies, you bring them to me. If I make a call you don't understand, ask me and I'll explain it. I don't make decisions without reasons." She let that settle. "Any questions?" she said. Harlan raised his hand slightly, an almost comically formal gesture that she could see he made without thinking, and then looked slightly embarrassed about. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice entirely neutral. "The beans," he said. "Are we going to keep having them every day?" "Yes," she said. "It's winter. You need the beans." He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a ruling he doesn't entirely love, but can respect the logic of. Buster made a sound that was definitely a swallowed laugh. "All right," Wyatt said. "Back to work." The crew dispersed. Gus was the last to leave, moving with the particular careful dignity of his 70-plus years, and he stopped beside Mabel on his way to the door and said without looking at her directly, "Ellen would have liked this," he said. She looked at him. Gus's wife, 31 years, not long enough. "Thank you, Gus," she said. He went out. Mabel stood in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen, and she let herself feel the full weight of the morning. For exactly 1 moment, the announcement, the crew, Gus's 3 words, the writing that was already being prepared for signature in Wyatt's careful hand, and then she went into her kitchen and she started the day's work, because that was what you did with a life you were building. You showed up for it, every morning, without waiting for someone to tell you it was allowed. The starter was on the shelf, still rising, still honest, still exactly what it had always been and more than anyone had thought to look for. She fed it and she got to work, and somewhere in the main house she could hear the quiet, steady movement of a man who had walked through the wrong door and had in doing so opened exactly the right one. The written agreement was signed on a Monday. Wyatt had prepared it himself in his careful, unhurried handwriting, and he laid it on the kitchen work table without ceremony. 2 pages plain, language nothing buried in it. Mabel read every word. She read it twice. She asked one question about the quarterly provision review process. He answered it. She suggested one modification to the wording. He made it without argument, and then they both signed it. Buster witnessed it because Buster had been hovering near the kitchen doorway with barely concealed excitement since breakfast, and it seemed unkind not to let him be part of the moment he was so clearly desperate to observe. "Is that it?" Buster asked when both signatures were on the page. "That's it," Wyatt said. That's a significant thing that just happened." "Yes," Wyatt agreed. "I'm just saying, historically speaking, for this ranch." "Buster," Mabel said. "Ma'am, go feed the horses." He went, grinning so hard it looked like it might cause him physical difficulty. Wyatt picked up his copy of the agreement and looked at it for a moment. Then he folded it and put it in his coat pocket and looked at Mabel with the expression she had come to understand was his version of satisfaction, understated real, the look of a man who had done the right thing and didn't need anyone to confirm it. Provisioning review 1st of December, he said. I'll have the numbers ready, she said. He nodded and left the kitchen, and Mabel held her copy of the agreement in both hands and looked at her own signature on it and thought, there it is. Her name on a document that gave her formal authority over something real. Not a courtesy, not a favor. A signed, witnessed legal acknowledgement that she was a person with standing in this operation. She put it in the tin box next to Clara Vickers' letter and her mother's recipe cards. Then she went back to work, because that was the thing about rights properly earned. They didn't change what you did. They changed the ground you stood on while you did it. November moved through the ranch like a patient, deliberate force, and Mabel moved with it. She had never experienced a working winter this far north from the inside of a functioning authority, had never had the latitude to make the decisions she could now see needed making and simply make them. At Red Hollow, she had watched resources mismanaged and said nothing, because saying something cost more than the loss. Now she watched and she acted, and the distance between those two things was vast enough that she sometimes caught herself standing in the middle of a task, feeling something she finally identified as competence being used at full capacity, which was an entirely different feeling from competence being partially suppressed. She reorganized the cold storage in the second week of November, making the case to Wyatt with a sketch and 3 numbers, and he approved it in the time it took him to review her sketch and say, "That's better than what we have. Do it." She developed a rotation system for the dry goods that reduced waste by a margin she could measure. She identified a supplier in the next town who could provide better quality salt pork at a lower price than the current arrangement, drafted the letter herself, sent it, and received a confirmation that saved the ranch actual money by December. Small things. But the small things were what a ranch ran on, and she knew it, and now that she had the authority to address them, they accumulated into something that could be measured in the difference between a ranch that survived winter and one that came through it in stronger position than it started. Wyatt noticed every one of these things. He said so plainly, the way he said everything, without embellishment, without qualification, just the fact of it stated, and left to stand. "The salt pork supplier," he said one evening, looking at the comparative costs she'd laid out. "I've been using the current arrangement for 4 years. "I know," she said. "I didn't look for a better one because I knew what we had and it worked." "Things that work aren't always the best available," she said. He looked at her. "That's either about the salt pork or it's about something else." "It's about the salt pork," she said evenly. Then, "and possibly other things." He looked at her for a long moment with that face, the one she'd been cataloging for months, the one that moved through things quietly, without letting them show until they were fully processed. Then he looked back at the numbers. "I'm finding," he said carefully, "that a significant number of things I thought were settled turn out to be worth looking at again." "Are you still talking about the salt pork?" she asked. "No," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. Mabel looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the honest thing and the safe thing and the growing specific difficulty of pretending those were still 2 different things when applied to Wyatt Callahan. "Wyatt," she said. "Mabel," he said. "I don't know how to do this," she said. "In case that's not obvious." "You think it's obvious for me," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the steady, measured attention she knew, but something more exposed. The look of a man who had been running a careful operation and had just acknowledged out loud that it was running him too. "You've been on your own for a long time," she said. 14 years, he said. "Since my wife passed." She had not known about a wife. Nobody had mentioned it. Not Buster, not Gus, not anyone. And she understood suddenly that it wasn't because they didn't know. It was because in the particular culture of men who respected each other, some things were not spoken unless the man himself opened the door. He had opened it. She sat with that. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said. She was a good woman, and it took me a considerable number of years to stop measuring every subsequent thing against what it wasn't." "And now?" Mabel asked. He looked at her directly. "Now I'm sitting in a kitchen at 9 o'clock in the evening, having an honest conversation with a woman who checked the floor slope her first week and fought her own battles and saved my flour from a burst pipe and still somehow finds time to notice when an old man needs softer food for his hands. He paused. I stopped measuring against what it wasn't about 6 weeks ago. Mabel breathed. 6 weeks ago, she said. That was before. Before Clifton left, yes, he said. Before the storm. Before the agreement. He let that land. I wasn't planning to say any of this tonight. I wasn't planning to hear it, she said. And yet, she agreed. The silence between them was the most charged it had ever been, not uncomfortable, but full. Dense with things that had been accumulating across months of late evenings and honest conversations and small deliberate acts of consideration in both directions. She looked at him and she said the truest thing she knew. I'm not the same person I was when I left Red Hollow. I'm still figuring out who this person is. I know, he said. That doesn't worry you. No, he said. Because I've watched you figure it out. And every version I've seen has been worth knowing. She pressed her hand flat on the table, the gesture she always made when she needed to feel something solid. All right, she said softly. All right, he said. They didn't say anything more that evening, but when he left the kitchen, he left differently than he had before, and she stood in the warmth of the range for a long time, and she felt the particular exhilaration and terror of a woman who has allowed herself to want something specific. Something exactly this. Something this much. The second twist came from a direction she had not anticipated, which was becoming. She reflected something of a pattern in her life. It arrived in mid-November in the form of a man named Gordon Price. She heard him before she saw him. A voice in the yard carrying the kind of volume that presupposed an audience, the kind of voice that had never learned the difference between confidence and imposition. She heard Wyatt's voice in response, lower controlled, and then boots on the kitchen steps and Wyatt in the doorway. His face was doing the thing it did when he was managing something and didn't want it to show, and was mostly but not entirely succeeding. I need to tell you something, he said. All right, she said. She set down her knife. Gordon Price owns the ranch to the south of us. He's been wanting to discuss a grazing agreement for several months. He paused. He's also the man who, before you arrived, he made an offer to buy part of Callahan Ridge's operational rights, the kitchen and provision side of the operation specifically. He wanted to supply this ranch's provisions through his own trading arrangement. Mabel looked at him steadily. And you didn't take the offer. I didn't think it was a good arrangement for the ranch, he said carefully. When was this? August, he said. Before I went to Red Hollow. She processed this. So when you came to Red Hollow looking for a cook, I was also making a decision about how this ranch's provisioning was going to be managed. Yes, he said. I found you and made a different choice. And now Price is here. And he knows you're in the role that would have been part of his arrangement, Wyatt said. I don't know what he's going to say about it. I wanted you to know before he has a chance to say it to you first. She stood very still thinking. He's the kind of man, she said slowly, who came here expecting a certain arrangement and found something different. Yes. And the something different is me. Among other things. She untied her apron and folded it over the basin edge. Then I'd like to meet him, she said. Wyatt looked at her. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. This ranch's provisioning is my domain. If someone has an opinion about how it's managed, they can have that opinion in front of me. He stepped aside. She walked out into the yard. Gordon Price was a large man well fed with the posture of someone who had been told all his life that his presence was a gift to whatever room he occupied. He looked at Mabel the way men like him always looked at women in professional positions, not with hostility exactly, but with a kind of elaborate incomprehension, as if she were a piece of furniture that had inexplicably moved itself to an unexpected location. Miss, he started. Hartwell, she said. Mabel Hartwell. I manage provisions and resource decisions for Callahan Ridge. You're here about a grazing agreement. He looked at Wyatt. The look said, is this a joke? Wyatt's face said absolutely nothing. Price looked back at Mabel. He recalibrated visibly the way men do when they realize the room has different rules than they assumed, and they have to decide whether to play by them or leave. "I understand," Price said carefully, "that Callahan Ridge has made some internal changes since we last spoke." "We have," Wyatt said. "Miss Hartwell's position here is formal and permanent. Any discussion about operational arrangements that touch her domain includes her." "Her domain," Price repeated, as if the word were in a foreign language. "Her domain," Mabel confirmed. She kept her voice pleasant and her spine straight, and she looked at him with the particular calm of a woman who had stood in front of Clifton Reeves and had not blinked and was not going to blink now. What followed was 40 minutes of conversation that Price had walked into expecting to control, and which did not go the way he planned, because Mabel had reviewed the ranch's provision costs thoroughly enough to know exactly where a southern supply arrangement would help, and where it would cost more than it saved. And she said so plainly with numbers, and Price found that arguing with numbers is considerably harder than arguing with a woman's general right to have opinions. By the end of it, the grazing discussion was tabled for a formal meeting the following week. The provision arrangement was not on the table at all, and Gordon Price left with the air of a man who needed to go home and think about several things. Buster watched him ride out from the stable doorway and then looked at Mabel with undisguised awe. "You just," he started. "Buster," she said. "You just absolutely horses," she said. He went. Wyatt was standing near the kitchen steps. He was looking at her with an expression that was as close to unconstrained as she had ever seen from him, something warm and specific and not at all hidden. "Numbers," he said. "Numbers don't have opinions about who's holding them," she said. "No," he agreed. "They don't." She went back into her kitchen. But she heard him laugh, a real one, brief and quiet, as she went through the door, and she carried it with her through the rest of the afternoon, like something warm in her pocket. December arrived and brought the full weight of a Montana winter with it. The cold was not the polite, manageable cold of October. It was serious and committed, the kind of cold that required a different quality of attention from everyone on the ranch. The men worked shorter hours in the worst of it and came in colder and needing more, and Mabel adjusted everything accordingly without being asked, and before the adjustment became obviously necessary, which was her way. Gus's hands were bad on the coldest mornings. She had started without discussion, leaving a bowl of warm water on the side of the range where he could soak them before breakfast, and a cup of coffee beside it already poured. He had said nothing about this for 2 weeks. Then one morning he came in and found it there as usual, and he stood for a moment with his hands around the bowl and said to no one in particular, 31 years I had a woman who noticed things like this. Mabel was at the range. She didn't turn around. "She sounds like she was remarkable," she said. "She was ordinary," Gus said. "That's what I didn't understand until she was gone. She was ordinary the way water is ordinary. You don't think about it until you don't have it." She said nothing. Sometimes the right response to the true thing was simply to let it breathe. "You're like that," Gus said. "In case nobody's told you." She turned then. Gus was looking at his coffee cup, the way he looked at things when he was saying something he meant, but didn't want to make into a production. "Thank you, Gus," she said. He nodded once and didn't say anything else, and she turned back to the range, and she let herself feel the full weight of those words from a man who measured worth by the most honest possible standard. She was like water, essential, unremarkable in the best way, present in a manner that people only fully understood in absence. She had spent so much of her life being made to feel that invisibility was her flaw. She was beginning to understand it was, in fact, her particular and specific kind of strength. She didn't announce herself. She just made everything work better. The difference now was that she knew it, and she was done apologizing for it. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Thursday night in the second week of December, and it started with something small, the way the most significant things usually did. Mabel was at the work table late going over the December provision numbers for the formal review, and Wyatt came in at his usual hour, and she poured his coffee without looking up, and he sat on his stool and watched her work in the comfortable silence they had built between them over months. After a while, she said without looking up, "The east fence repair is going to cost more than the estimate." How much more? He said. She told him. Where does it come from? He said. Feed budget has room, she said. We came in under on November's feed because I renegotiated the hay arrangement mid-month. I didn't mention it because the number wasn't final. She paused. It's final now. He was quiet for a moment. You renegotiated the hay arrangement. The original supplier was shorting the weight by about 4%, she said. I checked 3 deliveries before I was sure. Then I went to the competitor and used the discrepancy as leverage. Silence. She looked up. Wyatt was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him before and couldn't fully read. What? She said. Nothing, he said. Then Mabel. Wyatt. I need to ask you something. She set down her pen. You said that once before. Last time I offered you a job, he said. This time is different. Her pulse did something she chose not to examine directly. All right, she said. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle, a gesture she recognized as the thing he did when he was about to say something he had been building toward for a while and was now committed to finishing. I've been thinking about this ranch, he said. About what it is and what I want it to be. About who I've been building it alone all these years, and whether alone was ever really the right approach, or just the one I defaulted to, because it was available. He paused. You've been here 4 months. In 4 months, you have changed how this operation functions at a level that took me 14 years to reach, because you see things I don't see, and you do something about them before I know they needed doing. You protected the flour before the pipe burst. You found the hay discrepancy before I knew we had one. You handled price in 40 minutes with a pencil and a ledger sheet. I had good numbers, she said. Mabel. His voice was steady and serious, and completely without performance. I'm not talking about the numbers. She was very still. I'm asking you, he said, to build this with me. Not as my cook, and not as my provisioning manager, though you'd keep doing both, because you're extraordinary at both. He held her gaze without wavering. As my partner. In the full sense of that word. In every sense. The kitchen was completely quiet. Mabel looked at him. She thought about this pan thrown against the wall at Red Hollow. She thought about the 40 miles of road she had driven towards something instead of away from it. She thought about the sourdough starter that had outlasted Harold Vickers, outlasted 6 years of being told she was replaceable, outlasted every voice that had tried to make her small. She thought about Gus's hands in warm water, and Clara's letter in her tin box, and the agreement signed in plain language that gave her something real to stand on. She thought about what her mother had said. About things worth having, requiring consistent, honest care. Not grand gestures. Just steady, daily showing up. She thought about this man who had walked through the wrong door and had been showing up every day since. Not grandly, not dramatically, just consistently, honestly, without stopping. And she thought about the thing she had said to herself in the kitchen at Red Hollow, pressed against the work table in the dark, that she was afraid in the specific, quiet way of someone who had decided to want something again after a long time of not permitting themselves to want anything at all. She wasn't afraid of wanting it now. That was the difference. I have one question, she said. Ask it, he said. Is this because of the hay discrepancy? She said. He stared at her for exactly 1 second. Then something in his face broke open, in a way she had never seen. Not laughter, but something that contained it. Something that was made of the same material as the quiet laugh she'd heard when she went through the kitchen door after the price conversation. No, he said. It is not because of the hay discrepancy. Just checking, she said. Mabel. Yes, she said. Her voice was quiet and certain, and she looked at him without flinching. Yes, I'll build this with you. He looked at her across the work table, across the flour and the ledger and the coffee cups, and the 25-year-old sourdough starter on the shelf, and she could see in his face the exact same thing she felt in her chest. The large, specific, somewhat terrifying sensation of arriving somewhere you had not quite let yourself believe was real. All right, he said. All right, she said back. They were married in March, when the worst of the winter had passed, and the ground was beginning to soften. and the ranch was turning toward the business of spring, with the reliable, unromantic energy of a working operation that did not pause for sentiment. The ceremony was small. Gus stood beside Wyatt. Buster cried, which he had apparently decided in advance was something he was going to do, and had made no attempt to prevent. Tomas wore his good hat and brought wildflowers he had found. Somewhere nobody asked where, and they were in a tin cup on the table when the brief ceremony was done. Mabel wore her best dress, which was not elaborate, and she stood in front of the man who had asked a question nobody else had thought to ask, and she said the words that made them partners in every sense, and she said them without a single tremor in her voice, because she was not afraid of this. She had been afraid of wanting it. She had not been afraid once she decided of having it. There was no grand celebration after. The men ate well, she had made sure of that, because feeding people well was her language, her native tongue, the way she said things she meant. And there was music from somewhere, and Buster made a speech that was mostly incomprehensible through his continued weeping, and that everyone agreed was very moving regardless. Gus sat at the end of the table and ate his meal slowly, and when she passed him on her way back from the range, he said without looking up, 31 years and worth every single one. She pressed her hand briefly on his shoulder and kept moving. Later, when the evening had wound down and the crew had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet, Mabel stood at her work table and she fed the starter. Wyatt was behind her, leaning against the doorframe. Her doorframe, their doorframe now, and he watched her without saying anything. She covered the starter with its cloth and stood with her hands resting on the crock, and she felt the warmth coming up through the cloth. The living warmth of something that had been kept and cared for and had outlasted every attempt to diminish it. 25 years, Wyatt said. 25 years, she confirmed. Your mother's. And mine now, she said. And whatever comes after. He came to her then and stood beside her at the work table in the kitchen that was hers and his and theirs, and he put his hand over hers on the cloth-covered crock, and they stood like that in the warmth of the range and the quiet of a ranch that was sleeping around them, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing left that needed saying. The starter rose, as it always had, as it would. In the years that followed, Callahan Ridge became known throughout Montana for two things: the quality of its operation and the quality of its bread. The operation was Wyatt's doing, and Mabel's doing equally, which everyone who spent time at the ranch understood, and which they stopped finding remarkable after a while, because the remarkable things, if they're real, eventually just become the way things are. Mabel expanded the kitchen garden. She developed a provision system precise enough that the ranch went through 3 harsh winters without serious shortage. She trained 2 young women who came to the ranch looking for work, and she trained them the way her mother had trained her, completely, without holding anything back, because knowledge withheld does not protect the holder. It only diminishes what could have been built. She wrote to Clara Vickers once the following spring to thank her for the letter. Clara wrote back. They corresponded twice a year for the rest of their lives, 2 women who had both survived Harold Vickers in different ways, and who understood each other without having to explain the specific shape of what that survival had cost. The sourdough starter was still on the shelf. Buster, in his 2nd year at the ranch, developed a genuine appreciation for sourdough bread that he described to anyone who would listen in terms that were mildly embarrassing and completely sincere. He was eventually given the task of feeding the starter on Sundays, which he took more seriously than most men took their formal responsibilities, and which Mabel allowed because the starter responded well to him, and because sincerity, she had learned, was worth protecting wherever you found it. Old Gus lived to see 3 more springs at Callahan Ridge. On the last one, he asked Mabel to make the pot roast, Ellen's pot roast, as he'd come to call it, even though she'd never once made Ellen's recipe only her own. And she made it, and he ate it slowly with his hands wrapped around the warm bowl, and he thanked her, and that night he went to sleep and did not wake up. Tomas dug the grave, and Wyatt said the words, and all the men stood with their hats off in the early spring air, and Mabel stood beside Wyatt with her shoulder against his arm, and she thought about 31 years and not long enough, and the particular grief of people who are missed before they're gone, because you already understand while they're there what the absence will cost. She made the bread that day. She made it for all of them. Because that was what you did when something was lost that mattered. You fed people. You stood at the range and you put your hands to work, and you made the thing that reminded them they were still here and still cared for and still held inside something worth being part of. The ranch kept going. The way ranches do. The way real things do not. Through drama, not through grand events, but through the daily, consistent, unglamorous work of people who have decided that this thing is worth their showing up for. Wyatt said once years later, when someone asked him how Callahan Ridge had come to be what it was. He said, "I walked through the wrong door one evening, and I had enough sense not to walk back out of it." The person who asked him laughed, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. Mabel Hartwell had been 25 years old and invisible in a kitchen when a dusty, exhausted cowboy tasted a biscuit and stopped. Just stopped. In the middle of everything, the noise and the indifference and the accumulated weight of all the years she had spent being told she was not worth noticing. One man put down his fork and asked a question nobody else had thought to ask. And the question had not saved her. She had saved herself. But the question had reminded her that saving was necessary, that she was worth the trouble of it, that the woman behind the kitchen door deserved to be seen, that extraordinary things do not stop being extraordinary simply because no one in the room has bothered to look. She had walked 40 miles toward a life instead of away from one. She had stood in front of Clifton Reeves and did not lower her eyes. She had signed her name on paper that gave her standing. She had fed people and fought for herself and kept her starter alive and learned slowly and at real cost that belonging somewhere does not require the permission of everyone who would prefer you didn't. It requires only the decision to stay. The sourdough starter was still on the shelf. 25 years when her mother gave it to her, every year after hers. Still rising, still alive, still honest in the way her mother had promised it would always be responsive only to the truth of how it had been kept indifferent to anything else. Mabel kept it the way she kept everything worth keeping, steadily, honestly, without grand gestures, without stopping. That was the whole of it.